Saw the headline, but you probably didn't see the real story hiding underneath it. The official version is simple and deliberately narrow. Donald Trump confronts Cynical's Maduro. Pressure is applied. Rhetoric hardens, and the familiar language of strength, deterrence, and moral clarity fills a space where complexity used to live. In this version of events, the operation is framed as decisive, contained, and necessary, another episode in a long-running standoff between a sanctioned government and an American administration promising resolve. It sounds clean, it sounds manageable, it sounds like a story that has already been told before, but that is precisely the problem. The version that fits neatly into a headline is not the version that explains what is actually being set in motion. What is described publicly as pressure is, in practice, a dense interaction between financial choke points, informal energy markets, intelligence signaling, and political theater aimed at multiple audiences at once. Venezuela is not being engaged as a country in isolation. It is being treated as a node inside a larger system of sanctions enforcement, regional compliance, and domestic political signaling inside the United States itself. The action is not just about Maduro's government. It is about how power is exercised when formal tools no longer deliver clear outcomes, and when escalation becomes a substitute for resolution. In the official telling, escalation is assumed to be linear. Increases resistance, weakens, outcomes follow. Yet the system this strategy operates within is not linear at all. It is adaptive, fragmented, and filled with actors whose incentives do not align with the stated goals of the operation: energy traders, regional intermediaries, military institutions. And foreign governments all read the same signals differently, and they respond not to moral framing, but to risk and opportunity. When pressure is applied unevenly, it does not simply compress the system, it distorts it. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the risks are not being absorbed where the rhetoric suggests they will be. Sanctions do not fall on abstractions. They move through currency markets, shipping, insurance, food supply chains, and informal labor networks. They harden power at the top while dispersing instability downward. The people who benefit from prolonged uncertainty are rarely the ones named in speeches. The people who absorb the shock rarely appear in briefings. Media coverage, particularly when filtered through ideological lenses like those often emphasized by Senator Carlson, tends to reduce this complexity to a confrontation between leaders as if personal rivalry were the engine driving events. But systems do not spiral because of personalities alone. They spiral when incentives reward escalation and punish restraint, when silence becomes safer than dissent institutions. And when admitting uncertainty is treated as weakness, what is being avoided in public discussion is not the possibility of failure, but the possibility that success itself is undefined. If pressure does not produce regime change, what does it produce instead? If containment fails quietly rather than explosively, who notices and who's already positioned to profit from that failure? The operation looks controlled from a distance. Up close, it is already interacting with forces that do not answer to Washington, Caracas, or any single capital. And once those forces begin to move, they rarely stop where planners expect them to. The question left hanging is not whether this confrontation escalates, but whether anyone involved still remembers how escalation used to end. The second layer of the story begins where official explanations usually stop at the assumption that control still exists. From the outside, the operation appears to be managed through familiar instruments: sanctions, diplomatic isolation, selective enforcement, and calibrated messaging designed to signal resolve without committing to irreversible action. This is presented as a posture of dominance, one in which escalation is optional and de-escalation remains available at any time. Yet inside complex systems, the moment you rely on signaling rather than outcomes, control begins to erode in ways that are difficult to measure and even harder to reverse. Venezuela today does not function as a sealed national economy waiting to be pressured into compliance. It operates through overlapping informal structures that have learned to survive constraint. Oil moves through shadow shipping networks. Currency flows through intermediaries that thrive on opacity. Political authority consolidates not because sanctions are ineffective, but because they reorder incentives toward loyalty, secrecy, and internal discipline. Every additional restriction strengthens the logic of siege, and siege politics reward the actors most comfortable with permanence rather than reform. This is where the operation begins to drift from its stated objectives. Pressure, when prolonged, stops being a means and becomes an environment. In that environment, survival replaces legitimacy as the organizing principle of governance. The question of whether a government is popular becomes irrelevant compared to whether it is durable. And durability inside constrained systems is often achieved by narrowing access not expanding it. For external planners, this creates a paradox. The more comprehensive the pressure, the fewer observable levers remain. Intelligence becomes noisier. Economic indicators lose clarity. Official statistics, already fragile, become performative. What looks like stability might simply be inertia. What looks like weakness might be adaptation. Decisions are then made on partial information, reinforcing a feedback loop in which misinterpretation drives further escalation. Meanwhile, the costs continue to travel downward. Workers absorb volatility through informal labor. Families absorb it through scarcity. Regional economies absorb it through migration pressure and unregulated trade. These are not side effects. They are the primary transmission mechanisms of the policy itself, yet they remain largely absent from strategic discussions, because acknowledging them would require admitting that the system distributes harm unevenly and often counterproductively. There is also the quiet complication of third-party actors. When formal markets close, alternative markets open. When official trade halts, brokerage emerges. When compliance becomes costly, circumvention becomes profitable. These actors do not oppose the pressure campaign, they monetize it. Over time, they acquire influence not because they are powerful, but because they are necessary. Once embedded, removing them becomes politically and economically expensive. Public debate rarely addresses this layer. Not because it is hidden, but because it is inconvenient. It challenges the narrative of clean leverage and controlled outcomes. It suggests that the operation may already be producing a new equilibrium, one that is more resilient to pressure, less transparent to outsiders, and more dependent on instability than resolution. If that equilibrium solidifies, the original objective quietly dissolves, replaced by a permanent management of crisis. And once a crisis becomes permanent, the incentives of everyone involved begin to change. The unresolved question is no longer whether pressure will work, but whether anyone involved still benefits from it ending at all. The third layer of the story emerges not from action, but from silence. As the operation unfolds, what becomes increasingly visible is not the intensity of debate, but its absence inside institutions that are designed to question assumptions. Policy circles narrow, media framing simplifies. Disagreement is reclassified as disloyalty or navet ton. The space for internal friction, the kind that historically prevents strategic drift, shrinks quietly without formal announcement. What remains is consensus without clarity. A shared posture that substitutes repetition for reassessment. This silence is not accidental, it is structurally rewarded. In systems where policy failure carries diffuse consequences, but political deviation carries immediate cost, the rational response is alignment. Officials do not need to believe the strategy will work. They only need to believe that questioning it is riskier than continuing it. Over time, this logic produces an echo chamber in which escalation feels safer than pause. And momentum replaces deliberation inside that environment. Warnings become softer, then conditional, then hypothetical. Analysts shift language from probabilities to possibilities, from forecasts to scenarios. By the time concerns surface publicly, they are framed as external variables rather than internal design flaws. The system protects itself by reframing responsibility, not by correcting course. Markets respond faster than institutions. Capital does not wait for official acknowledgement of risk. It prices uncertainty immediately, quietly reallocating exposure through insurance premiums, shipping rates, and currency hedges. These adjustments are invisible to most political actors, but they reshape the terrain long before policy catches up. By the time instability is recognized, it has already been normalized. There's also a deeper discomfort at play. Admitting loss of control undermines the premise of intervention itself. If pressure no longer guarantees influence, then the entire framework of coercive policy must be reconsidered. That reconsideration threatens careers, reputations, and longstanding ideological commitments. It is easier then to maintain the appearance of control than to confront its erosion. As the operation drags on, it stops being confined to Venezuela and starts interacting with political cycles beyond it. In the United States, a confrontation becomes a reusable reference point, invoked not for what it achieves abroad, but for what it signals at home. Policy toward Venezuela is folded into narratives about strength, credibility, and resolve abstracted from its material outcomes and repurposed as proof of posture. The operation becomes symbolic capital. This is where the risk profile changes. Again, when foreign policy is absorbed into domestic signaling, it becomes less adaptable to external reality and more sensitive to internal optics. Adjustments that might reduce instability abroad are now filtered through electoral consequence. Media framing And ideological alignment, the cost of appearing uncertain begins to outweigh the cost of being wrong. At the same time, institutional memory hardens. New officials inherit not just a policy, but the language used to defend it. That language constrains what can be said and, by extension, what can be done. Options that were once open become rhetorically unavailable. The policy space narrows, not because alternatives disappeared, but because acknowledging them would disrupt continuity. Internationally, this rigidity is observed and quietly exploited. Other governments learn how far pressure can go without triggering reassessment. They calibrate responses accordingly. Some align publicly while disengaging privately. Others wait, knowing that prolonged stalemate often weakens the initiator's flexibility more than the target's endurance. Time, once again, shifts leverage in unexpected directions. What remains largely unspoken is that prolonged confrontation trains all participants to operate within permanent tension. Crisis becomes normalized, exceptional measures become routine, the threshold for what counts as escalation rises, not because the system is safer, but because it is more desensitized. This creates a dangerous lag between action and recognition, a delay in which meaningful change can occur without being registered as such. By this stage, the original headline has lost relevance. The confrontation is no longer about a specific leader, a specific government, or even a specific country. It is about how systems behave when they cannot retreat without admitting misalignment and cannot advance without compounding risk. The unresolved question that lingers is not whether anyone will choose to escalate further, but whether the system has already redefined escalation so thoroughly that the next step will only be recognized after it has already reshaped the landscape. The final layer of the story comes into focus when the system reaches a point where outcomes no longer need to be intended in order to occur. At this stage, the operation persists not because it is actively chosen, but because reversing it would require a collective acknowledgement that the framework guiding it no longer corresponds to reality. That acknowledgement carries institutional cost. It challenges assumptions about leverage, credibility, and control that extend far beyond Venezuela. It raises questions not just about one confrontation, but about an entire method of exercising power in a world where economic pressure substitutes for direct engagement. What is quietly formed is a self-reinforcing structure. Pressure generates adaptation, generates opacity. Opacity generates mistrust. Mistrust justifies further pressure. Each step feels logical from within the system. Yet the cumulative effect is a drift toward conditions no one publicly articulated as a goal. The operation does not need to fail spectacularly to be dangerous. It only needs to continue without reflection. The risk now is no longer limited to miscalculation. It is structural entrapment. Institutions trained to apply pressure find it difficult to operate without it. Narratives built around confrontation struggle to imagine resolution. Economic actors accustomed to uncertainty integrated into pricing models and supply chains. Embedding instability into the baseline over time, the extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the system loses its ability to distinguish between control and motion. What makes this especially unsettling is how invisible the turning point becomes. There is no single decision that marks the moment when containment gives way to escalation or when leverage becomes liability. The shift happens incrementally through routine actions taken in good faith, justified by precedent, and insulated by diffusion of responsibility. By the time consequences surface clearly, the architecture that produced them is already entrenched. The headline suggested a clash of leaders and a test of will. The deeper story is about how modern power operates when it cannot stop itself without undermining its own logic. It is about systems that continue not because they succeed, but because ending them would require admitting that success was never clearly defined.